Hi, I'm Chris Hinz, and I'm here to guide you through my presentation and campaign as to why I think we should be legalising drugs in Australia. Now, one of the reasons why we should be legalising drugs in Australia is because the war on drugs has failed for a few different reasons. And one of the main things is it's treated people who are addicted to drugs as if they're criminals. And obviously, if there's something that's black market, it's going to be underground and there'll be criminals selling it. So it's added to the loot of criminal cartels. It's cost taxpayers a lot of money, which is something I'll go into later. And it's been based on fear rather than facts, which is another slide I'll obviously go into later. And there's been no sort of public consultation as to what's wanted here. It's just been implemented, and we've followed in the lead of America, who've had the war on drugs, and that's just the way it's been done. There's nothing else. So I've got a link to an article from The Age here, which says why some of those things are the case, and also a link to a article from the ABC saying that racial profiling is an issue with the war on drugs, which is another thing that I'll go into later. So some key facts for us, and this is coming from a Vice, or two Vice articles. There are 75 drug-induced deaths for every 100,000 people in Australia, which is quite high, and it was 9.2 in 1998, which was the highest number, the peak number. And this happens a lot during festivals. And what we have with sniffer dogs, they're not necessarily accurate. They've only got a 36% accuracy rate, which is just over a third accuracy, and that's not particularly high, I suppose. So we've got a quote from David Caldicott from one of the previous articles, who says that it's not really the peak, it's only going to get worse from here, and that it's going to, be a significant cost to Australia, deaths and hospital bills and so on. That's Dr. David Caldicott there. So I've got a TEDx talk here, which explains the point that I was making first off, which is that the war on drugs treats people who are addicted as if they're criminals. And what this guy from England says is that people who are addicted are criminalized, they're punished, they're given these lengthy sentences, they're arrested, they're at the very least fined. And what he says is that in countries like Portugal, where what they've done is legalized all drugs, and what they've said is that rather than giving someone who's addicted punishment, we'll make sure that we give them a stable job and we give them a connection to the community. And that's worked a lot better in countries like Portugal than it has in the UK or Australia or USA, where they've just gone straight to punishment. And one of the quotes he has is that we should be singing love songs to addicts rather than just war songs, which I think was a nice one that I've included here. Racial profiling was something that I also touched on a bit earlier, and there's a little bit of a reference from a TED talk that I had about a guy in America who also went into research on drugs just like the other guy, and his research was that 1 in 3 black males would eventually be arrested for a drug-related offence in their lifetime. I think the number he said was 1 in 17 or something along those lines for the white males, so that there was a racial discrepancy for sure. And a very interesting TED talk I found by another guy in America who said that it's always been racially based, and he went into the Chinese immigration and how they tried to stop marijuana for that because they were afraid of the Chinese immigration, and he went into the cocaine and how that was related to Mexican immigration and black immigration. And the quote he had in his TED talk, which I've included here, was that if the principal smokers of cocaine were affluent older white men and the principal users of Viagra were poor young black men, then it would be easy to get smokable cocaine from your doctor, and selling Viagra would get you 5 to 10 years behind bars. So he's making that point and that analogy to say that it's a racial thing rather than, to an extent, rather than why it's dangerous. And then I've linked us back to that article I found from the ABC about racial profiling in Australia. The cost to taxpayers is something I'd touch on a bit earlier. And some information I got from an article here is that the war on drugs costs Australia $1.1 billion annually. And some of the money might be used for law enforcement, like arrests and so on. But 70% of drug-related offences in Australia are cannabis-related. And even though cannabis is relatively harmless when compared with ice, but because it's still illegal, it does make up the majority of those arrests. So that's a lot of money that's used up on just the fact that that's not legalised, which I think would be very different if it was. And there was some pretty silly ads that I've got here as the link to, which was a lot of money, $350,000 by the New South Wales government as a cost to the Australian taxpayer, and that was really widely criticised because it was just comparing cannabis users to sloth, which even the article says that even the Premier of New South Wales didn't like it, and he was running that campaign. And I got another article from the Sydney Morning Herald from 2009, which says that the government spent about $4.7 billion a year on the war on drugs, which might be a bit outdated, but it's still a lot of money. So the last TED Talk reference I have here is from this guy who was also in the UK, and he said that alcohol's caused just as much damage to people as drug-related offences. So you've got like drink driving, you've got domestic violence, you've got abuse, you've got all sorts of problems and crimes that are created as a result of alcohol. But we don't talk about it as being a dangerous drug in the same way we talk about other illicit drugs like cannabis or crack or ice, which obviously all are dangerous to some extent, but we need to reevaluate. He says that we need to reevaluate the way that we talk about drugs and which drugs are helpful and harmful, and just because something's legal doesn't mean it's not harmful, and just because something's illegal doesn't mean it is harmful. And just that the way if we legalize drugs, it would change that conversation. He says obviously as humans, lots of different societies throughout time have wanted to change their perception of consciousness through something like drugs, and there's always been the racial element, which I talked about, and that's also been based on fear, as that guy Ethan Nadelman said. It's always been about the racial elements have always been about fear as well. So that's really why we've used fear as a cover-up rather than the facts about drugs as a justification for this war on drugs. What if we legalize drugs? Well, as I said earlier, we would have rehab rather than punishment, and we'd be treating the people who are struggling with drugs as addicts as we would an alcoholic or a gambling addict or something like that, rather than criminals, and we wouldn't be punishing them to the same extent. Benefits. We've got benefits of medical marijuana as one of the main drugs we can benefit from, and I'll go into that a bit later. And also, something else I'll go into later, drugs will be safer because of your regulation and quality control, because you want to be putting out a quality product and you want to produce a quality product, and that quality product will be safer to consume rather than dangerous one. And it might cause us to reevaluate what we think of dangerous and not dangerous, as the TEDx talk went into. And rehabilitation of punishment is something that I touched on a little bit earlier. So as the first TEDx talk, Johan Hari said, the rehabilitation and the reconnection to community rather than just sending someone straight to jail has been a way of dealing with drug addiction rather than just straight out punishing someone. And that's something that we looked into and it's been effective. So it's not a good thing to just threaten someone with incarceration if they take drugs again, because basically almost all addictions, lots of people will relapse, and if you do relapse, you go back on drugs and you will end up in jail anyway. So it doesn't really work. And there's a thing about Switzerland where we have a drug assisted program, which I've got a link to, and they sort of weaned the users off drugs, and that's been a way of just easing people out of the habit rather than forcing them off it. It's sort of cold turkey, as it were. So back to those medical benefits that I mentioned. There's pain relief for chronic pain like arthritis or MS, and anxiety relief, and I've got a link to some of those medical benefits here from the Business Insider. And there's a story of a little girl who had seizures, and she was struggling with those through a lot of her young life, and she was only 2. And the dad went in and tried to have a look at taking preventative measures with cannabis oil, and that cannabis oil basically stopped her seizures entirely. And then they went in for a brain scan also as well, and the brain scan said there's no problem, there's no epileptic signals or anything showing up in her brain at all. So that was fantastic for that family. So some past examples of where we've used regulation and safety and how that's improved quality control. So prohibition is obviously one of the big ones. That failed because as a society, and like in the US, look to stop drugs, the demand increased rather than decreased, which is, they thought it was going to decrease, but it just kept getting more and more popular. And as a result, people started drinking quality alcohol rather than just bad quality moonshine or unregulated alcohol. And it's not something that's been banned in the past, but it's much easier to buy and safer, in fact, to buy proper cigarettes than to buy these black market cigarettes, because as I said before, it's about wanting to make a quality product, and to make a quality product you'll get more sales. So cigarette companies, they have a high quality pure cigarette with less dangerous elements to it than a low quality cigarette which you might buy off the black market. So there are obviously some counter arguments and dangers to taking drugs, and I've just gone into some ways that we could address that. Obviously there's the reference that I put in before about Switzerland's drug program, where someone does get unfortunately hooked onto hard drugs and they need to be weaned off it. They can do it like Switzerland's program, but in order to stop that, we want to be making sure that those are still illegal and make sure they don't get into the wrong hands. And the way that we do that is to have a age limit, like over 21, make sure all drugs that are legal don't get into those hands, and the drugs that are too hard are still remained as illegal. And mild drugs should be the only ones that are legal, like marijuana, for instance. And the more dangerous ones, like ice, should remain illegal, as I said. And the quality control of the product should be really strict, just like with cigarettes. In places where it's worked, famously, you've got places like Amsterdam and Colorado where cannabis is legal. We've got Portugal, sorry, not Poland, don't know where I got that from. We've got Portugal legalizing drugs and giving addicts the connection to the community, which is from that first TEDx talk by that guy in the UK that I said before, and they've had great success with that. And in Australia, we've got Nimbin, where it's in New South Wales, and drugs aren't legal in New South Wales, but the police have been trying to crack down on that, but there's been mixed results. Like it's known for being a very relaxed town with its attitude to cannabis and so on, and they've got the drug culture there, so that's what they're famous for. And I think if we legalize drugs in Australia and followed through some of the points in this campaign, we may see similar success to places like Switzerland or Portugal or Amsterdam, and some of the medical benefits which we've seen in places like Colorado as well. So these are my references, and thanks very much for listening to my talk. Hope you learned something new.